Shavuot Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Peah. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Chet. The Mishnah now is going to discuss a case where robbers harvest the first half of my field and I, the owner, harvest the second half of my field. What is the halakha regarding leaving the Peah, leaving the 1/60th of the produce for the poor people? If robbers harvested the first half of the field and I, the owner, harvested the second half of the field, you leave peah from the second half of the field where you harvested. Rabotai, to make this easier, we learned in yesterday's Mishnah that if non-Jews or robbers harvest my field against my will, I didn't hire them to harvest my field, or they're robbers, I do not leave peah or give peah from what they harvested, because I have to harvest the field in order to give peah. The Torah says when you harvest your field, you're harvesting. Now, in this case, we're speaking about where the goyim or the robbers harvested the first half, so that half is exempt from peah because I have to harvest it. The second half, however, I harvested. Therefore, I have to give peah, the 1/60th of only that second part of the field that I harvested. The Mishnah now discusses another case where the first half of the harvest is different than the second. If I harvested half of the field and then I sold the second half of the field, the buyer of the second half of the field must leave peah from his half to cover the entire field. Now, Rabotai, just to make this simple, the Rav writes like this. We're going to read it in the Mefarshim. When you harvest the field, the mitzvah is not to leave a corner of every portion that you harvest. The mitzvah is to leave a corner standing from when you harvest from beginning to end. I harvested my part of the field, there's still crops standing. Therefore, my obligation of leaving peah still remains on the crops that are standing. Until that part is harvested till the end, you still do not give peah, you leave peah at the end. The buyer now, when he comes to buy the second half of the field, he has to leave a corner in order to cover the entire field because the obligation of peah is standing on his crop. The contract, the selling, the buyer cannot say, oh, I did not know I was going to have to leave. That's not true. When you buy that second half of the field, it's an agreement built into the sale that I'm selling you the field minus the peah that you have to remove to cover the mitzvah of the field. We say this, the Mefarshim say, Mistama yodea koneh shamocher lo iniach peah avur machatzit harishona. Presumably, we assume that the buyer knows that if there's still a part of the field remaining, that means the owner did not remove the peah. Therefore, he knows he's buying it on account, al dat, on condition that he's going to separate that portion of the peah. So the sale is, I'm selling you the field, that part, minus what you have to remove. If, however, Rabotai, very interesting, they say the opposite case. I sold the first half of the field to a random person and I harvested the second half of the field for myself. Each one must give peah on its own. Why? Because now each person has his own field. In this case, the reason the buyer has to separate is because when I harvest my first half, my obligation still didn't come in yet. It's still on the second half that he buys. But if I sell the first half and now I have the second, each one of us have our own field, we're going to have to give two peahs. Likewise, the Mishnah speaks about if I harvested half of the field and then I consecrated the second half, I gave it over to the Bet Mikdash, the funds of the Mikdash. I said this is now belongs to the Bet Mikdash. Hapodem yad gizbar, one who comes to redeem that second half from the temple official, he goes to the Bet Mikdash and he says, I want to buy this second half that was donated to you. Hu noten peah, he must give peah. And the Rav writes, V'chen hapodem yad gizbar, motzim min hachatzi shepada peah v'yon lesideh kula. The buyer that's going to receive this second portion of the field, he's going to have to remove peah from his portion to cover the entire field that was given over and that was harvested by the original owner. Now, Rabotai, interesting they say here, מדובר שפדת המחצית השנייה בעודה מחובר אל הקרקע וקצרה. This is talking about a case where I went to the Beit HaMikdash and purchased that land, the produce, before it was harvested yet. It was still attached to the ground, and I came and harvested it. Now, because I harvested it, I must leave Peah in the corner of the field. However, if the Beit HaMikdash hired workers to harvest it while it was in their jurisdiction, it becomes completely exempt. Why? Because we learned previously, grain that was produce that was donated to the Beit HaMikdash has no obligation of Peah. So if I come in and buy it now, I bought produce that is exempt from Peah, so it's considered like there's no obligation of Peah, and I would be exempt. That is the end, Rabotai, of Perek Bet. We are beginning Perek Gimel now, Masechet Peah. The Mishnah now is going to continue discussing cases of how do we have a situation where one field can be considered two, or two can be considered one. The Mishnah speaks about right now, Malbenot Tvua Sheben Hazetim. A person has squares of grain that were planted between olive trees. I encourage everyone, if you have access, they have certain Mishnayot that show you pictures. It is very worthwhile to see how you have trees, and in between each tree, in separate blocks, you have squares where you are planting grains. Bet Shammai Omrim, Bet Shammai, Rabotai, the Rav writes that Malben literally means a brick mold. It's a square mold used for shaping bricks. It also refers to a square patch of grain whose shape is similar to that of a brick mold. So a farmer planted grain in the spaces between the olive trees in his groove, so the grain grew in separate patches between the trees that looks like bricks, like brick molds. Malbenot Tvua Sheben Hazetim, Bet Shammai Omrim, Bet Shammai say, Peah mikol echad ve'echad. The farmer must leave some grain as peah from each and every one of the squares, because Bet Shammai holds each one is considered a separate field. Bet Hillel Omrim, Bet Hillel say, me'echad anakol. You leave peah from one square to cover all of them, because they are all considered part of a single field despite the spaces between them. Now, Rabotai, the Rav explains, very interesting. Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel agree on the basic principles. They're arguing a very specific case, meaning both agree when a farmer purposely separates the grain, his grain crop, into distinct patches that could have easily been combined, such as where the trees are widely spaced, each patch is considered a separate field. You had the ability to put them all next to each other. By you distancing them, you're making it show like it's a separate field. And both agree that where it's impractical to make them close to each other, right? Because the trees are closely spaced, the separation does not show that you want them to be separate fields. It's just that was what happened. That's the only option you have. So they're considered part of one field. They both agree in those cases. They're arguing a very limited case. If you look at the commentaries explain the Rav. They're arguing where the space between each tree is 18.25 amot. The space the space that would be between 10 trees evenly distributed in a field. So you have 50 amot by 50 amot. Right? Beit Shammai considers that to be a case of widely spread trees, whereas Beit Hillel considered to be a case of closely spaced trees. And we said, if it's closely spaced trees, they're in a way where I cannot make them close to each other. I have to make them separate. Everyone agrees that it's one for all, that it's one for all. And whereas Beit Shammai say it's considered to be widely spaced, so by you separating it, you have to give out each and every square. If the trees were more than 18.25 amot apart, even Bet Hillel would agree that you have to give on each and every one because it's considered widely spaced, and each patch of grain would require its own peah. And if the trees were less than 18.25, even Bet Shammai would agree that in this case it's closely spaced, and by you separating it's just because you had no other option, and therefore it would be considered one field. You only have to give one. The Mishnah is talking about a very specific case. Again, Rabotai, just to sum it up, if the trees are tightly packed and you had to separate the patches, these brick molds of grain, because that was the way your field was built, it's all considered one field. You only give off one square. If, however, the trees are widely spaced and you had the option to put all these square molds next to each other, but you separated them, you show that it's going to be considered a separate field for each and every square. Bet Shammai, Bet Hillel are arguing a very limited case. Again, if possible, try to see the Mefarshim, try to see the pictures, that'll clear it up very well. The Mishnah continues, Umodim she'im ayu rashe shurot me'oravin. Bet Shammai agree. If the edges of the rows were connected, so you have each edge of each square was connected at some point to the square next to it. So you have a connection between each of the ones. Shu noten peah me'echad al hakol. Even Bet Shammai agree in this case where they're far apart, but if each edge connects to the next square to its friend, even Bet Shammai agree that it's all considered part of one field. Again, Rabotai, I encourage everyone to try to find the pictures. I would show you if I have them. I don't have access to them here right now. Everyone should have a Shavua Tov. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.